Hello, church family. Welcome to today's Sunday school lesson. We are in session 13, the final session of this quarterly, and it's entitled Purged. And our key idea this week is destruction comes to those who dishonor God. And our verse this week, our passage this week, is Genesis chapter 19, verses 12 through 26. And our first question is, why do people often fail to consider the consequences of their actions? Why do people fail to consider the consequences of their actions? Well, I think a lot of times that we don't consider the consequences. We see a good consequence, whether it be fortune for us or maybe the misfortune of someone else, an enemy of ours, but we prefer to have a we have one goal in mind. When we make a decision or we do an action, we have one goal in mind. We don't consider the other consequences that might happen. I can speed on my way to work, which gets me to work on time, but the other consequences to that are I might get pulled over and I get a ticket, and the ticket causes some kind of financial change where I have to pay money toward a ticket instead of paying money for something else, whether it be bills or something like that. There's consequences there because it not only affects me, it also affects my family and affects the way that the budget works that month and all of these kinds of things. And we fail to recognize those consequences in the moment. And so how many times would things have gone better if we had first considered the consequences of what we were about to do before we actually did it? Well, today we're going to be looking at the consequences of the actions of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so just a little bit of context. We've skipped a whole chapter. We went from chapter 17 last week. We're in chapter 19 now, the second half of chapter 19. And chapter 18 happened, and we didn't see any of it. So what happens in chapter 18 is that the Lord promised Abraham and Sarah that they would have a son, and then God tells Abraham that he had chosen him and that he gave Abraham a purpose. Then he said that he would become a great and powerful nation. All the nations of the earth will be blessed through him and through the nation that would come from him. And he said, in the end, there would, in verse 19 of chapter 18, it says, this would be accomplished through the faithful obedience of Abraham and his offspring. Well, we know that the only one who was truly faithful and obedient was Jesus, and which would be the only one son of Abraham. The only son of Abraham. Oh, did that? Okay. I'm just making sure I didn't actually accidentally stop recording. The only son of Abraham who was able to do that was Jesus Christ. So then the second half that was the first half of chapter 18. The second half of chapter 18 was that Abraham was realizing that God was going to bring judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah for their wickedness. If you know the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, you know that there were a couple of angels that appeared to Lot to warn him of the destruction that was coming. But before that actually happened, God had already condemned Sodom and Gomorrah and had already passed judgment on them and was going to destroy them. And Abraham realized this. And so he calls on God's character and interceded to God, with God, on Sodom's behalf, and bargained and tried to beg God. And eventually, at first he said, God, if I can find 50 people who are righteous in the city of Sodom, please spare it. Will you spare it? And God said yes. And then Abraham talked him down to the number of 10. Well, Abraham never actually got a chance to go and look for 10 righteous men, but we know by context that there probably were not, because Sodom and Gomorrah did get destroyed. And what happened was the judgment got passed. Sodom and Gomorrah were going to be destroyed, and there were two angels that visited Lot that were going to rescue him and his family. And these men in Sodom began grabbing grabbing these two angels, and they wanted to have sex with them, and they wanted to defile these angels. And so Lot protected them. Lot kept them. But the only reason Lot was being protected was because he was related to Abraham. He was related to the man that God had promised to make into a great nation. And because of his love for Abraham and his faithfulness to Abraham, he was also being faithful to God, was also being faithful to Lot, his nephew. So let's read verses 12 through 26. We'll go pretty quickly through this. We know the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, but let's read this together. And then the angel said to Lot, "Do you have anyone else here, a son-in-law, your sons and daughters, or anyone else in the city who belongs to you? Get them out of this place, for we are about to destroy this place because the outcry against its people is so great before the Lord that the Lord has sent us to destroy it." So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law who were going to marry his daughters. "Get up," he said, "get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." But his sons-in-law thought he was joking. At daybreak, the angels urged Lot on, "Get up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away in the punishment of the city." But he hesitated. Because of the Lord's compassion for him, the men grabbed his hand, his wife's hand, and the hands of his 2 daughters. They brought him out and left him outside the city. As soon as the angels got them outside, one of them said, "Run for your lives, don't look back, and don't stop anywhere on the plain. Run to the mountains, or you will be swept away." But Lot said to them, "No, my lords, please, your servant has indeed found favor with you, and you have shown me great kindness by saving my life, but I can't run to the mountains. The disaster will overtake me, and I will die. Look, this town is close enough for me to flee to. It is a small place. Please let me run to it. It's only a small place, isn't it? So that I can survive." And he said to them, the angel said to Lot, "All right, I'll grant your request about this matter too, and will not demolish the town you mentioned. Hurry up, run to it, for I cannot do anything until you get there." Therefore, the name of the city is Zoar. Zoar, the city that became Zoar, used to be called Bela, which meant destruction. This new name for the city means insignificant. Zoar means insignificant. The sun had risen over the land when Lot reached Zoar. Then out of the sky the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah, burning sulfur from the Lord. He demolished these cities, the entire plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and whatever grew out of the ground. But Lot's wife looked back and became a pillar of salt. So first we have our first section. This is called urgency. This is not a laid-back moment. This is not a moment where it is time to rest or hesitate, and we see the hesitation. Let's read verses 12 through 17. Then the angel said to Lot, "Do you have anyone else here, a son-in-law, your sons and daughters, or anyone else in the city who belongs to you? Get them out of this place, for we are about to destroy this place because the outcry against its people is so great before the Lord that the Lord has sent us to destroy it." So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law who were going to marry his daughters. "Get up," he said, "get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." But his sons-in-law thought he was joking. At daybreak, the angels urged Lot on, "Get up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away in the punishment of the city." But he hesitated. Because of the Lord's compassion for him, the men grabbed his hand, his wife's hand, and the hands of his 2 daughters. They brought him out and left him outside the city. As soon as the angels got them outside, one of them said, "Run for your lives, don't look back, and don't stop anywhere on the plain. Run to the mountains, or you will be swept away." So, like I said, Lot was not saved because he was righteous. He was saved because the Lord showed compassion toward him and his family, and because of God's love for Abraham, that may have also played a role in Lot's rescue. But first, when we look at the section, why did the angels grab the hands of Lot and his family? And what does this tell you about God? Well, Lot hesitated. In verse 16, it says, "But he hesitated." And because of God's compassion for him and his compassion on him and compassion toward him, the angels grabbed his hands and his wife's hands and his daughter's hands and rushed him and his family out of the city. This tells us that God comes and rescues those who he has meant to rescue. He is not going to leave anyone that he intends to rescue behind. He's not going to leave it up to chance. He's not going to leave it up to a roll of the dice, and if he has a plan for us, He's not going to let us get swept up in something else. He's going to rescue us from it. So why then do people ignore or hesitate in the face of God's promised judgment? Well, so one thing that comes with this, because we could argue that, well, if God isn't going to let anyone die or get swept up in destruction that he has a plan for, then we don't have to worry about going and sharing the gospel because God will rescue those who he intends to rescue. But the problem with that is that when we see the face of God's destruction, when we see that it's coming, when we're told about it, that ought to urge us to have faith in him. And it's that faith, brothers and sisters, that saves us. For it is by grace you have been saved through faith. That faith that we get is a gift from God. He's going to give us that faith, but we have to respond. We have to we don't initiate it. We see here that God initiates salvation, but we have to be willing to give ourselves over to it. So we need to not ignore the face of God's judgment. We need to not ignore the destruction that is to come because of God's judgment. We ought to that ought to call us to go and spread the gospel even more, because we know that judgment is coming. We know that it is going to get way worse before it gets better, and we know what is in store for those who do not believe. So our second section, this is bargaining. This is verses 18 through 22. But Lot said to them, "No, my lords, please, your servant has indeed found favor with you, and you have shown me great kindness by saving my life. But I can't run to the mountains. The disaster will overtake me. Look, this town is close enough for me to flee to. It is a small place. Please let me run to it. It's only a small place, isn't it, so that I can survive?" And he said to him, the angel said to Lot, "All right, I'll grant your request about this matter too, and will not demolish the town you mentioned. Hurry up, run to it, for I cannot do anything until you get there. Therefore, the name of the city is Zoar." So, Lot bargains with the angel and says, "Wait, I can't make it to the mountains. That's too far away. That's so far away. And by the time I get there, your destruction on Sodom will have already reached me. The destruction you're about to pour out, it's going to overtake me. It's going to beat me to the mountains, and I'm going to die." And so we see the fear of Lot here. We see him scared of the Lord's destruction, and he goes to the angels and says, "Hey, let me run to the smaller town. Let me go to this town that's a little closer. It's insignificant. It's a little bitty place. Let me go there, and I'll live there instead of this big lavish town of Sodom, this rich town, this town that has become rich, and because of its richness has become a place of defilement and depravity." He's going to this little town, a humble place that gets the name Zoar, which means insignificant. So when we are going and requesting things of God, do our responses sound more like Lot's or Abraham's? Are we bargaining for the salvation of others, or are we bargaining for our own salvation? I want you to think about that. When you go to the Lord and you're asking for salvation from something, not literal soul salvation, but salvation from pain or salvation from sickness, do you often request it for others, or do you request it for yourself? We can be assured that we can go to the Lord with honest questions. Both of these are valid. This was not an invalid question that Lot was asking. He was asking something that, yes, was selfish for him and his family, but it was still a valid question that was granted by the angels, and therefore by God. But how can our hesitations get in the way of God's plan? If we don't go to the Lord with those things, if we do doubt and we do hesitate, well, we can often get caught up in the judgment as well if we don't make the right choices in time. And then finally, judgment, that we should be and we should be careful to obey God in all things. Well, let's look at this as verses 23 through 26. The sun had risen over the land when Lot reached Zoar. Then out of the sky the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah burning sulfur from the Lord. He demolished these cities, the entire plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and whatever grew on the ground. But Lot's wife looked back and became a pillar of salt. Jesus actually references Lot's wife in Luke, in the book of Luke. He says, "Remember Lot's wife," when he was teaching about the second coming. Some people think that Lot's wife may have been a native of Sodom, and she was looking back on her home, which was being destroyed. But why was she judged? Why was she turned to a pillar of salt? Well, because, brothers and sisters, she didn't obey the Lord. She didn't obey the angels of the Lord, and therefore the Lord himself. And they told her to not look back in verse 17. Don't look back and don't stop anywhere on the plain. And she did look back. She looked back and she became a pillar of salt. But what would cause us to look back on the Lord's judgment? What are some things that have been judged in your life and you look back on it? I think that Lot's wife was looking back on the judgment with self-pity and not with a righteous mind of, look what God has saved me from, but rather was disobedient in her looking back because God told her not to. And instead of moving forward with her life, turned and looked backward at what her life used to be, and she mourned it and she had self-pity for it. This doesn't mean that we ought not to look back at what our life used to be and look where Jesus has brought us now. Instead, what this is a picture of obedience, that when God says jump, we don't hesitate. We don't even ask how high. We just jump. And when God says don't look back, I'm moving you to this place now. Don't look back. Don't mourn where you came from. Just go. We ought to just go and live in obedience. This is not a fun story. This is not a encouraging story if you look at it just on the surface. But what it is a story of salvation because of God's own compassion. Lot wasn't a righteous man. Lot was living in the most sinful city at the time. We can compare this to cities like Las Vegas and cities like maybe Copenhagen, or not Copenhagen. I am at a loss at the moment. But we can compare this to what we would consider sinful cities in, let's just say, America, like New Orleans or Las Vegas or Los Angeles or New York, or these cities where there is rampant sin available and ready to spring onto us. And instead of moving past and moving on, Lot's wife was judged because she looked back at what her life used to be and what it was, and she was judged for that. So I think this is a good encouragement for us to be obedient to the Lord, for us to be mindful of what we do with God's instructions and not to hesitate when he gives us an instruction. Thank you so much for being with me today. I look forward to worshiping with you very soon. Bye-bye.